Is this good? Okay. So Jared's here with us for the next 45 minutes. So if you have any questions, you go ahead and raise your hand. I'll come around, bring you the mic, and you can ask, and we're just going to have a conversation. So who wants to go first? Oh, I saw his hand first.
Is this thing on? First of all, thanks for coming. I'm actually a huge fan of the podcast, so I'm like super nerding out over that, so that's great. I don't know, this is maybe a little more of an open-ended question, but I'm just wondering if you could just comment a little more on around the idea, the tension around, I hear a lot of, and I grew up Catholic, and so I have that sort of background and everything, and I still do this occasionally. The idea of finding answers to modern problems in ancient texts, like the Bible,
Right.
like as a tough thing for me. And you mentioned cell phone use as an example of that, but you hear a lot of stuff like abortion comes up, or anything involving technology, like it comes up. It's like, well, just look in the Bible, and it's like, well, how do I look in the Bible for an answer to a question that's couldn't have been asked in 50 AD?
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. I think it's a great question. I think it's a category mistake. I'm going to maybe say something a little more provocative, that I don't go to the Bible for any sort of moral compass. Because the problem is, there's a few problems with that. One, there's this difference between prescription and description, right? So, meaning, when I read about David's life, let's say, complicated figure, right? What is the Bible describing and just telling us this is what happened versus prescribing, saying, and this is what you should do too? The Bible doesn't tell us when it's describing something and when it's prescribing something. Does that make sense? So, whenever the Bible is describing something, we can easily just say, okay, well, that was just back then, that's not now. So, for instance, when God tells the Israelites to wipe out the people who are already in Canaan because God had promised the Israelites that land, is that a description, or does that have some sort of ethical import for us today? The Bible doesn't tell us, right? And so what happens is we have to adjudicate that for ourselves. What is the Bible describing and what's it prescribing? So when it says that women need to have a head covering, we've decided collectively that that's just the Bible describing an ancient context. It's not prescribing anything for us today. Oh, right. I forgot my context. That was more provocative than I thought than I intended it to be. No, so what that means for me is, if we take it one step back, what's my compass? What am I using to decide? What's the framework I'm using to decide my ethics? It's not the Bible, because I have to decide what's descriptive and prescriptive. Whatever I'm using to do that is more of my ethical compass. It's my framework. Something has already compelled me to say, that was for back then, that's not for now. Whatever that is my ethical compass. And so I'm going to be more clear about, I'm an advocate for bringing that to the surface and saying, well, what are we actually using to make moral judgments? What are we actually using to decide what's good and bad, what's right and wrong? Because I can guarantee you it's not just the Bible, because the Bible is full of contradictions about what we should do about certain things, and so it's an impossibility to use just the Bible. So for me, my starting place is just to say, I don't go to the Bible for that. I use it as a tool. It's a part of the conversation. I'm interested in what parts of the Bible say about different things, but that becomes part of a process that's much bigger than the Bible.
You still got a question?
I was just curious, when you said the Bible doesn't quote the Bible and then Jesus is quoting Scripture, how do you parse those two things out?
Yeah, that's a good point, right? The Bible does, what I object to is using the Bible as a monolithic term to talk about a 66-book collection that gives us God's rules for all time. The Bible does not ever refer to itself in that way at all. Do certain passages of Scripture refer to other passages of Scripture? Yes. But we also have Jude referencing first Enoch, which isn't even in our Bible. But Jude's quoting Enoch. So what do we do with that? Like, okay, there were clearly other things that were important. Or in the Old Testament, it'll say, you'll come across something that says like, so-and-so did such and such, and isn't more written about this in the book of the Annals of the Kings. What is that? That's a book we don't have, the book of the Annals of the Kings. Apparently that was a book that they used to get this information into the book of Kings that we don't have. So it's me, when I say the Bible doesn't reference itself, it does not, there's no indication that the Bible, in fact, it's a logical impossibility that it could. Like I said before, when Paul's writing in 50s, he says all Scripture, he can't be talking about the Gospels because they weren't written yet. So it's referring to parts of it, sure, but it also is referring to Enoch. So there wasn't this clear distinction between what's in the Bible and what's out of the Bible. And it's certainly not referencing a 66-book collection. Again, I kind of tongue-in-cheek mentioned, depending on your tradition, that's 72 books, 73 books, 81 books. So what do we mean by the Bible? In my tradition, there was just this assumption of what that meant. But that, once you scratch the surface, that concept starts to be a lot more gray than the black and white that I was taught. I don't know if that helps. Yeah.
Okay. There's that big gray area. Well, so the Bible says that to go to heaven, it's only through Jesus. Mm-hmm. And so that's always a big hanging chad, right? So I just wanted to see what your thoughts were on that.
Okay. I think we're about out of time.
That's a big one.
So the question on the table, right? John 14:6 says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Right? There's a few things I would say about it. I don't have a definitive answer to that, first of all. But so my job is to complicate things, not make them clearer, just to let you know. By saying that the only way to heaven is through Jesus, we have to disentangle so much baggage around what we mean. What it doesn't say heaven, actually, it says the Father. Those are not the same thing. We've already jumped to something that the Bible does not say. So with that, that's important. 2, even if it did say heaven, we've already brought 2,000 years of church tradition baggage into what we mean by heaven. And its corollary hell, right? So we've already brought a lot of baggage into that. We've already, again, I don't know your tradition. My tradition would have told me what that means is I need to ask Jesus into my heart. Like literally with words, I need to invite Jesus into my heart. And if I do that one time, and I do it sincerely, then I go to heaven forever. That concept is not in the Bible anywhere. Nowhere in the Bible are we supposed to invite Jesus into our heart. So to even get to that point, I think we have to also look at all of these things that we're bringing to it. Because once we start unpacking what does the Bible say about heaven, that's going to chip away at that. Once we say what does the Bible say about hell, that's going to chip away at that. What does the Bible say about salvation in general, which is almost never talked about as a spiritual reality. It is talked about as a physical reality. All of the Old Testament talks about salvation in a physical God will redeem this people group from their physical, actual enemies. That's what salvation means in the Hebrew Bible. Right? The idea of the afterlife in the Hebrew Bible is real gray. It's fuzzy. Right? It gets clearer and clearer as we get into the New Testament. So these concepts, I think, when we say, John 14:6 says, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. We put so much baggage into that. I would actually want us to start looking at John's theology, because John is a weird guy. So he's the most heavenly minded of all the gospel writers. Right? Probably the latest written, probably not written by John, written by the community, that sort of the disciples of John, so to speak. And so he speaks in what I want to say, this is not fair to John. he speaks as though he's been on several trips, right? Like he's been doing some shrooms. The way he talks about this celestial Godhead stuff is very abstract. That's the word I want to use, right? So we have to take that into account of like, what else does John say that is like, I think in John, what is it? John 5? No, I'm just making stuff up. I don't know when it is in John. He has this other thing where Jesus is like talking to the disciples and says like, no, if you don't eat of my flesh or drink my blood, you have no part of me. And the disciples are like, this is crazy talk. Like, that's disgusting. What do you mean? We're like, in the early church, the Romans actually would have accused early Christians as cannibals because of this passage. Like, they thought they had these secret, like, sex cults where they had sex with their brothers and their sisters because there's so much, like, kinfolk talk in the Bible, and that they were cannibals because of this passage of, like, you have to eat people's flesh and drink their blood. Like, it's weird. So, in the context of John, I would expect something confusing like that. Like, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. He says later, I and the Father are one, right? So there's clearly this connection John is trying to make between Jesus and God. John's argument is Jesus is God, which again, someone like Mark that's not at all part of what Mark would write about, that Jesus is God. So all I have to say, that's a long way of saying I don't know what to do with that, but I do know that it's easy for me to see how it does not mean what I grew up thinking it meant. So there's a lot of other ways of thinking about it that don't lead to the conclusion. What the Bible is saying is, if you don't accept Jesus into your heart, you will go to hell forever. That verse does not get me there at all. Yeah.
Can you just briefly describe your testimony and walk with God?
No, I cannot do that briefly. Yeah, you can get personal. I like to keep it real nerdy and abstract. My testimony, I took my faith very seriously. I think for a lot of us, and by us I mean people who've made a faith transition out of a more conservative religious tradition, nothing hurt my feelings more than being told the reason I didn't hold to these conservative tenets anymore was because I didn't take my faith seriously. Because it couldn't have been further from the truth. I was obsessed. I carried a Bible in my back pocket all through middle school and high school. I was reading it constantly. I was a youth group leader at age, 15, 16. I was in the youth and on the leadership team. Like I said, I was leading worship bands at 12, 13 on the worship team. Come from a very religious family. My grandmother is a traveling itinerant charismatic preacher. Not anymore. She's 83 now. So now she does it locally. But yeah, growing up very, very religious. So my mom's side is charismatic, speaking in tongues, that whole thing. My dad is Southern Baptist. So it was an interesting tradition. And I saw both of those things for what they were. So my faith was always very personal. I asked Jesus into my heart probably like 10 times, because you only have to do it once, but you're never sure it takes, right? So, like, when I would go to camps, I would ask Jesus into my heart again, and when I would go to, camp every year or whatever, I was actually baptized by the Power Team, any 90s Christians. Go Google that. That'll take up your afternoon. Yeah. It was like ex-pro football players who were also evangelical Christians. And so their mission was to go to churches and like do these feats of strength with like rip phone books in half, and they would like break out of handcuffs, and they would be like, God is even stronger than this. Or I don't know how they tied it together, but I was wowed by it. I probably thought, if I accept Jesus into my heart, I'll get to be strong like you. It did not work. Didn't take. So I was baptized by them when I was like 9 or 10. And so that was my culture, that was my life. Evangelicalism was a huge part of my life, and went to Liberty University. So I was very passionate about that. One thing that's important for me was, even though my family was charismatic, emotion-based religious experiences weren't really ever a part, and I thought I was broken because of that, because I grew up with the narrative that being Southern Baptist was good. That's what infant Christians are. They're like, get the basics. That's constantly, my mom would tell me, like, well, we go to a Southern Baptist church when you were younger because you get the basics, but then when you graduate spiritually, you graduate into a charismatic experience. Like, you get the Holy Spirit, and it becomes very emotional, and if you're not, like, if your emotions aren't in tune with the Spirit of God, then you're not as emotional, you're not mature, you're not spiritually mature. So spiritual maturity was defined as emotional experiences with the divine on a Sunday. And I didn't have that. I tried to speak in tongues, I tried to do all of that, and it didn't work. And so I thought I was just like broken, like, I guess I'm not going to be a spiritually mature person. And so, but again, I'm an 8, so instead of feeling like I was broken for too long, I just left that tradition and said, well, the tradition's broken. And so then I became Presbyterian, where religious emotional experiences were like, that's weird, don't do that. Like, just get super smart. Like, that's how you can be spiritually mature, is be smart. And I was like, yes, found my people. So I was taught, like, being smarter than everybody and being right about everything was how you expressed your Christianity. Like, that's spiritually mature, is 1 Peter 3:15, be ready to give an answer to anyone who asks any question about the hope that's within you. I translated that as be able to tell everyone why they're wrong, and if you can do that, you're a really good Christian. Right? And so that became that was the center of my faith, was being able to argue really well for why Christianity is true. I was a soldier for Jesus. I was able to, like, defend against all the attacks of the devil, which were just atheists or, like, scientists and stuff like that. So that was kind of my faith expression for a long time, through Liberty and then Westminster. And then my crisis of faith came when I recognized, like I said earlier, I was a jerk. Like, I just was a jerk. And all of my faith, I saw it in a moment, was about control and feeling safe, and not about trust and not about love. And so that was a critical moment for me, was looking back and saying, oh, I did all this, not because I was arrogant or thought I was better than everyone, but because I was wounded and I needed to feel safe. And I figured out that the best way to do that was to be the smartest person in the room, so that I didn't get surprised. And so then that kind of wrecked me for a while, of like, well, if faith isn't about being the smartest person in the room or about having these emotional, ecstatic experiences, like, what's it about? And that's kind of my journey. I wrote a book called Love Matters More, where, like, that became what it was about, was starting to see things through the lens of love. And so now my faith is inseparable from my pursuit of loving people well. So that's kind of where I ended up.
Thank you for sharing that with us. It's good.
Hi. So hypothetically,
Good, that's why I like to be, hypothetically.
let's
Let's get back to that.
say somebody has gotten burned out from the Bible and is ready to maybe start reading it again. What's some good, like, first book, first passages that we should start with to maybe, like, dip our toes back in?
Yeah, that's a good question. My first thing, I would go back and just say, one thing to consider if you haven't done this, if you're burnt out with the Bible, you haven't touched it for a while, pick up a few people who talk about the Bible before you actually read the Bible again. Because that can be really exciting to see how other people handle the Bible and be like, oh, it just gives you some, like, kind of grist for the mill of, like, oh. So, like, I'd recommend maybe, like, someone like Miguel de la Torre, who reads the Bible from a Hispanic perspective, and he's just fascinating. I'm a big, like, Malcolm Gladwell type, like, I love things that, like, make me be like, oh, I never thought of that before. That's incredible. So Miguel de la Torre, Will Gaffney, even, like, this is a harsh one, but, like, Phyllis Tribble's, like, Texts of Terror was an early one for me that I read, and I was like, oh my gosh, like, the Bible, how it handles women. Never saw that before. Oh, I didn't like that, I don't like that. But it was super interesting to me. So getting those tools of how other people handle the Bible before I actually went back into reading the Bible it was refreshing to see it from other people's eyes. Because one of the problems for me was, Just taking a break from the Bible didn't actually change anything. When I went back, I would just do it the same way I did it because I didn't have any other tool. Well, I can take a break, but then when I come back, I'm just going to do the same thing I always did because I don't have anything else to guide me. So that would be my first thing is get some diverse voices who handle the Bible in a way that maybe scares you. Or my good litmus test is if I would have thought of them as heretical when I was a teenager, I probably should read them now. And so I had lots of names that I was like, oh, yeah. I would have hid those from some people, like they hide like porn magazines or something from their parents. I'm like hiding Bart and like Schleiermacher. I think that's a good place to start. But in terms of actually reading the Bible, it depends on what you're interested in. Like, if you're interested in matters of justice, I'd say the prophets. Pick up Walter Brueggemann's Prophetic Imagination. It's a great first book on how to interpret the prophets in a way that is really life-giving, at least to me. So I'd say if you're interested in justice, matters of justice, the prophets, great. Read some Martin Luther King sermons. He's fantastic at interpreting the prophets for a modern context. If you're interested in matters of history and science and things like that, and how does the Bible interact, read Genesis. But again, read it with, maybe Genesis for Normal People was a book Pete and I wrote, or something like that, where you're like using it to think critically about these things now. If you just love Jesus, then start with the Gospels, and I would actually start with Mark. Mark was the earliest one written. It's the most human of the Gospels. There's an ending to Mark where we don't really even get like a definitive resurrection. I think that was added. I'm not a New Testament person, so don't quote me on this, but I think that those last verses are like added because it's like, well, we can't end here. Like, oh. And so Mark's great. Or again, if you want to be, take some shrooms, read John. It's great. So I think those are good places to start. I wouldn't recommend like Samuel King's or Revelation. That one's trippy too, but not in a good. That's like a bad trip. I wouldn't start there. You could start Ecclesiastes for someone like me who was like really pessimistic about everything in the world at that time in my life. Ecclesiastes was great. So, yep. I preached a sermon on Ecclesiastes. The last sermon series I preached before I stopped. No, I don't know if that's true. One of the last sermon series I preached when I was a pastor was through Ecclesiastes. This is so bad. Yeah, I haven't thought about that in a long time. And I called it The Purposeless Life. And I had my AV people, the designers, they made the logo for the series a cover of the Purpose Driven Life book, but like all the leaves were dead. And it was just like, yeah. I didn't make it too long after that.
Hey, good morning. Sorry. I can relate a little bit to your experiences in the sense that I grew up in the Bible Belt in Kentucky, and so that Southern Baptist culture is very much strong. I would say that where I really started questioning things was spending a year overseas, and the concept of love is really shown in a lot of religions, in a lot of cultures that don't necessarily know or acknowledge Jesus. So when you hear the term progressive Christian, for someone like me, it's a very slippery slope. So my question for you is, how do you define yourself as a Christian versus, say, a Universalist, and what really makes that love expressed through your faith as a Christian different than the love expressed elsewhere? So how do you hold on to your Christianity and not progress your way out of it as you're exploring?
Yeah, it's a great question. Again, my job is to problematize it. I think even the way you've asked the question already shows your hand, right? So you ask, how is it different? That's already making an assumption that it has to be different. And I would ask the question, why does it have to be different? And because again, the narrative I grew up with is because what I really want is to know the truth. And the truth is unique, and it has to be different from all the others because that's what I'm sort of after. Where if I ask, if the goal is to live a life of love, what do I care if, thank goodness other people know how to love well. Like, again, I grew up in a tradition where I believed the world was full of Christians and terrible human beings. That was it. If you're not a Christian, you are, having sex orgies on the street. Like, that's it. Those are the only two categories you have, right? Which, again, that's fine. Good for them. Why am I to judge that? Maybe I'd make them murderers on the street or something. So that, I think, is critical, that even how we frame it already has so much baggage in it, right? I used to, when we first started the podcast, I would get people who wanted to talk to me because they were losing their faith, and when I didn't have good boundaries for my time, I would say yes. And they would get on. I remember one in particular, this pastor gets on, and he's got fear in his eyes because he started this slippery slope, started down this path. And he got on, he didn't tell me this, but it became clear. He wanted me to save his faith. Like, tell me why Christianity is unique and better than everything else. And I was so disappointing to him. Because if anything, I kind of pushed him down the slope more. And like, I don't know, go for a ride, man. Like, it's kind of fun. The slope's fun. I don't know, what do you want me to say? No, but I have this like excitement for people because at that point of existential terror, because I've walked with hundreds of people through the podcast and everything, what I've noticed is, and I won't ever say this to them in the moment, but that moment of existential terror is actually the beginning of a beautiful thing. But it feels like it's the end of something. Like, it feels like my life, I'm losing my life. But maybe, like Jesus says, you're about to gain it. Because what I've seen is I've been able to walk with hundreds of people 3 years after that moment and saw the goodness that comes out of that, and the love that comes out of that, and the transformation and the freedom that comes from letting that go. It's super scary because it's all you've known, and it feels like you're just in this free fall. But if you can find a community like this where they embrace those questions, it can be such a liberating experience. But anyway, my answer to that question when he asked that, he said, why is it unique? Why are you a Christian? And I said, because I grew up as a Christian and I like it. I want to be a Christian. And he was, I think, wanted to punch me in the face because that's not what he was wanting. He wanted some objective, this is why we're so different, this is why we're better. And even saying it feels really yucky to me. Like, my faith, Christianity, is not about positioning myself as being better or right on anything. It's actually to let that go and to say, I don't know, I like Jesus and I want to follow Jesus and I want to love people well. And you know what? Why do I have a zero-sum mentality of competition? Like, my religion needs to be better than your religion. You figured out a way to love people well? Wonderful. Like, because what I'm interested in is more love in the world. I'm going to do it from a Christian perspective because I grew up Christian. I love my tradition. I love the language that I can use in that tradition. And so I don't think I'm ever not going to be a Christian. But it's because there isn't anything that's going to come along that's going to say, like, yeah, but here, Christianity's false, so you got to give it up. Like, I can't imagine what that would be, that someone would say that. I would just be like, well, okay. Like, the Christian tradition is so flexible. The more you understand, like, people say, Christians believe this. I'm like, I have 38 volumes of church history, all the like major churches. You can find the most heretical stuff you've ever imagined in that. And they're heralded as like heroes of the faith. Like, they're saints. Half of them have saint in front of their name. But it's because we've gotten to this narrow, right? There's a whole tradition of theologians that are called apophatic theologians, right? Apophatic. That's just a fancy way of saying they've determined there isn't anything we can actually say about God. Because everything we say is inadequate. God is ineffable, beyond any description, right? So what they say is, whatever you say about God is inherently false. Doesn't matter, because you can never, God is bigger than that. Whatever it is, God's bigger than that, right? So these apophatic things, by the way, this is like 500 years ago, 700 years ago. Some ancient desert fathers from 1,300 years ago. What they would say is, it's all heresy. What does it matter? Like, any language you use, the Islam, Buddhists, they're all using language, it's all inadequate. And that's from these Christian heroes of the faith. They're not saying, and our language is better, they're just throwing themselves in the mix, saying like, yeah, our language is all jacked up too, so better just to have doxologies and praise God or take vows of silence or, whatever, because whatever we say. So I guess that for me, it is an unsatisfying answer for people, but one, I couldn't care less if Christianity is exclusively right. It's not even a question I'm interested in. And two, I'm a Christian because I want to be. That's it. And it's such a different framework because I grew up thinking I was always searching for the justification for why I'm a Christian. That's what I needed. I needed to know that this is right in a unique way because then it justifies my decision to commit to this path. But I feel like faith is the exact opposite of that. And so I don't need it. Now, I think it's important to say, what that means then is I have to let go of a lot of other things. Like if, for instance, science says evolution is pretty indisputably true, and if I hold to the idea that Genesis tells me something about the origins of the universe, I'm not going to be like, oh, well, I just have faith. I'm going to reject evolution based on nothing. Like, that's not the kind of faith I would hold to. I would say, yeah, my definition of faith is flexible enough to say, okay, great, like, evolution's true. So now I rethink Genesis. And I'm always in conversation with that. And that's the tricky part is it's always a conversation. Like, being a Christian is never a category of existence. It's always a moment. It's, it's a decision at all times. So, yeah, and that gets real nerdy into like my view of metaphysics and ontology, where we are already in this modern framework of thinking we have stable identities, who I am. And I just have a very different understanding of what it means to be human. That's way more fluid than that we're always becoming. We're always changing. We're never what we were yesterday. We're not what we are going to be tomorrow. That even who I am right now will change 5 minutes from now. Now and now and now. We're always evolving. So to make declarative statements like that just don't matter much to me anymore. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, it'll be on in a second.
Okay,
There you
go. Kind of along those same lines, so along the idea of the theology of love and the uniqueness of Christianity, and something you said earlier about not really looking towards the Bible for kind of a moral compass.
Mm-hmm.
So in all this, where does sin come into play, in that concept of sin and why Jesus came to die and rise from the dead? Where does that all come in here?
Yeah.
To the uniqueness of why we would be a Christian.
You guys just come in locked and loaded with all the easy questions. Well, the first thing I thought of was biblical scholars recognize that what sin is, if we're talking about how does the Bible describe it, it's always a metaphor, and that metaphor changes. So if we go all the way back to the early texts of our Hebrew Bible, sin is a weight. And the sacrificial system is built on this idea that sin is a weight. So what that means is it's a burden on the community. And so the way we resolve that is we put that burden on a beast of burden and we send them out into the wilderness, right? Literally the scapegoat. That's where we get that phrase, the scapegoat. We put our sin on the goat, we send them in the wilderness to die, to carry our sin away from the community. Right? That was also often defined by, in the Hebrew Bible, sin is not this thing that separates us from God in this existential way. It is a matter of, we have a holy God, and again, so much baggage we put into that. Often that just means we have a God that can't be contaminated with humanness. And so in order to worship this God at particular places, we need to go through some ritual purification. Right? And if you don't do that, right, so for instance, you're unclean, women are unclean when they have their period in the Hebrew Bible. That's the reality. It would be false to call that sin. Impure and unclean does not mean sin in the way we're talking about sin. We have too much baggage. We put too much baggage on that term. Right? It just means there are things that you can and can't do in proximity to the temple because this is where God lives, and it's too pure, right, and holy for this uncleanliness, right? So everyone has to clean up before they go into this certain part. So anyway, it gets real like ritualistic, right? In ancient religious practices. That's just the reality of it. So if you fast forward, we go to the New Testament, around the time of the New Testament. And we don't talk about sin as a weight anymore. We talk about it as, anybody know what the dominant metaphor for sin in the New Testament is? No, it's a debt. That's the metaphor. It's a debt, right? Because now we're in a different economic model. We've literally, our evolution of culture, now we have money and we're exchanging things, and so sin's a debt, right? Jesus paid it all to him I owe, right? So this idea of exchange, that we owe a debt and now we give a debt, that's how the New Testament writers start talking about this sin thing, right? And then we can go through the history of the church and see how it changes again and again. Now in a lot of churches, you'll hear sin talked about as being unhealthy, like it's a dysfunction, right? Because we're in a therapeutic model of how we think about sin. And so it's easy to be like, well, sin is, this thing that we need to be healed from. It's like a medical term. It's a medical malady that we need to be healed from, which we also find in the Bible. These aren't monolithic things. So with all of that, all that to say, sin's a metaphor. What is sin? Like there's been, if you think that's simple, look into the scholarship around what is sin. It's like, I don't know. We got this scholar who says this scholar. It's like, it's a plethora of metaphors. What it is there's a thing that keeps us from being in the relationship with the divine that we were supposed to have. That's kind of what it is. And there's nothing really unique about that in the Bible. There's other cultures that have that idea too, right? Ritual purification and all of that is in other religions as well. The same goes for why Jesus came to die. Right? In the same way we have multiple reasons why we explain our problem, we have multiple reasons why we explain our successes. And so there's multiple views on what we call atonement theories. Right? There's atonement theories, and the reason that there's multiple of them and we can't come down on them is because the New Testament's not clear. It's not clear why Jesus came to die or what Jesus' death and resurrection does for us. Right? So I grew up in what would be called a penal substitutionary atonement theory tradition, which is to say, Jesus had to be punished on our behalf because God is just and has to exact some justice on our sinfulness. And so rather than punishing me specifically, that was also a good thing in retreats that get you to ask Jesus into your heart. Let's make it about me. Like, oh, I killed Jesus? Oh, geez, that's rough. So that's the penal is punishment. We're owed punishment. Substitution is, rather than me being punished, Jesus is going to get punished on my behalf. Right? Penal substitutionary atonement. You'll find that kind of language sometimes in the New Testament. You'll also find what's called ransom theory, which is Satan has stolen us from the grasp of God, and now Jesus is there to pay the ransom. Who is Jesus paying? Who is the ransom to? It's Satan. Satan is a powerful figure. In fact, for most of church history, that was the most popular atonement theory. Not penal substitutionary atonement, but ransom. Because in the Middle Ages, they were really big about the devil and demons and all of that. Satan was like a really powerful figure in the Middle Ages. So ransom theory made sense because Satan is so powerful that he basically, took this and then we had to ransom. If you Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, C.S. Lewis, that leans heavily on a ransom theory of atonement. The White Witch is so powerful that she is able to sort of enact this thing over the world without the divine's sovereignty. Like, the land of Narnia is not under God's control. It is under the White Witch's control. And then how do we break that spell? We have to have a ransom, right? So it's different than penal substitution, which is God is mad at everyone because we pissed him off. And now the only way we're going to not die in our sin for all eternity is for Jesus to come and sort of block all of God's wrath on our behalf. So we have ransom. We have Christus Victor, which was also a very popular atonement theory. And the reason these are all theories in the sense that we haven't all agreed on them is because we can find that language in the New Testament. The last thing I'll say about this, which is a little controversial, I think the reason for that is because the New Testament writers are also trying to figure it out. Like, what happened here? What does this mean? We don't know. This was not in the rule book. Like, we're like going through the pages of the Old Testament. Like, this is not in the playbook. Like, this is not how, what do we do with this? So they're like figuring it out as we go. One of my favorite examples of this is Paul in Romans, where we think Romans is this great systematic theology. But basically, he spends, 11 chapters, he's like figuring it out. He's like saying, well, what about this? And what about that? And what about this? And then he ends his great systematic theology. The end, like the climax of the book, undoubtedly, everyone agrees, is his doxology. And what does he say in his doxology? Oh, the wondrous riches of God's knowledge, they're too great to understand. Basically, he's like, forget it. I don't know how this works. Like, that's his climax of, like, his biggest book. Like, Romans is, like, where we get all this doctrine from. And it's really him being like, well, what about this? Well, I don't know. Let's follow that line of thinking. Well, then we got this. And it's like, okay, what about over here? And he's like, the wonders of God's goodness and grace. It's so, look at this. Don't look at the fact that I don't have this figured out. It's just so wonderful, right? The mysteries of God. So that is a great example of kind of the whole Bible. Like, even in the Old Testament, there's this really nerdy episode of the podcast where we have an Old Testament scholar who's talking about, does God have a body? How does the Bible talk about God's body? And what he points out is there's these 2 or 3 theological traditions within the Bible itself where if you follow it through, in this tradition, God definitely has a local body. Like, there's one God, and God has a body, and this is how God moves around. And there's another tradition where it says, like, no, God doesn't have a body. Like, God's everywhere, right? And these traditions are, like, in tension with each other. And it's like they're literally taking hundreds of years to, like, figure out, does God have a body or not? And I don't think they came to a definitive conclusion, right? Until we get to the New Testament. So that's a bigger question. My job here is just to ask more and more questions and not give you any answers. Of when you ask the question, what is sin and how does Jesus play into it? 2 things to know. One, there's not a univocal voice from the Bible that's going to tell us that. The Bible doesn't say one thing. It says like 4 or 5 things that don't really go together. And 2, I forgot what 2 was. Super important. I forget. But yeah, so that I think is the crux of it, is not to have this univocal voice for the Bible of what does the Bible say about. The Bible is evolving. The Bible is a part of this evolving tradition that we now have inherited for the last 2,000 years. So just in the same way we look at 2,000 years of church history and it says, like, this person said this and this person said this, we have that encapsulated in our Bible. Like I said, like, literally the first 2 chapters have a contradictory creation story that come from 2 theological traditions. And then it's like, okay, well, that's an accident. Like, okay, we can get over that. Then we get to Exodus and Deuteronomy. The most important parts of the Hebrew Bible are the law codes. And we have we have Exodus and Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy means second law. It's a second telling. And they change some of the laws than they do in Exodus. They're not the same. Right? Then we have the historical books, and we think, okay, now we're going to get one story that says the same thing. We get Samuel, Kings. Then we go to Chronicles. It tells the same stories, but it changes the details of them. Right? So it's asking the question of the Bible that it can't answer. Like, everywhere we turn, the Bible itself is telling. It's like, okay, but that's the Old Testament. When we get to the really important Jesus stuff, like, what's the story? Oh, now we get 4 stories. We start the New Testament with 4 accounts of Jesus' life that don't all go together, right? When was that last Passover? When was the Last Supper? Well, John says one thing, Luke says another thing. Like, okay, thanks. But rather than coming to the conclusion that maybe these authors and editors are big dummies and they're just not smart, maybe we start asking, maybe they did that on purpose. Maybe the point isn't to get, what does this mean? And I think the ancient writers and ancient audience understood that way better than we do, because we are post-enlightenment. What we care about are what happened. I want the facts. As though knowing the facts about how the world was made and all of those things will give us meaning and purpose and love and life. It's great for creating cell phones or making us live longer. That's great. But to think that the Bible isn't valuable because it doesn't give us the facts is a very modern problem. And it's our problem to solve. And I think we shouldn't put that on the ancient people and call them dummies because they started their Bible with 2 creation accounts. They don't seem to be bothered by it. It's pretty obvious. I don't think they were surprised that there's 2 creation accounts at the beginning of their Bible. Sorry, I went on a rant there. Go ahead.
No problem. We have one last question. It is almost 1, so we'll try to keep it brief.
Don't look at her for that. I'm the one that has to keep it brief.
Yeah, the question is quickly. Maybe the answer will be longer. I was wondering, how do you navigate in an environment of hate? This place is a safe place. We have been talking about all kinds of things, and we probably have some different beliefs, and we're open to talk here, but we not always can be in a place like that, and I don't want to feel like I live in a bubble, and I can be free here, but I can't be free there. So how do you do that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I may not be the best person to ask that, but from what I've learned, there's a few things. And again, I want to be careful because, say, your conflict style and your personality and your experiences, I think, will dictate what that actually looks like. Because for some people, you have to adjust, you have to know for yourself your own energy and capacity and trauma to go into spaces. I don't think it's healthy to go into a space when you haven't healed from your own wounds and expect to be gracious to people who are sort of pouring salt in that wound. I think it's a bad expectation. It will end up badly for you or for them or both. And so boundaries are really important. I love Prentice Hemphill's definition of boundaries, which is the distance at which I can love you and me simultaneously. And I think that's a really good definition. What's that space in which I can love you and me at the same time? And that space may be we don't talk about certain things when we're together. Maybe it's I can't be around you because you don't respect that, and when I do come in, you bring it up, even though I've asked you not to bring it up. And at that point, the way I can love you and me at the same time is we can't be together. And I'm sorry for that. I wish it weren't the case. But that's just the reality of where we are. So I think every situation, and this, by the way, is what I mean by wisdom. When we talk about a life of wisdom, I'm talking about in this situation, what's the most loving thing I can do? And sometimes it's to not be a part of this dynamic. That's the most loving thing I know to do. And that's hard in the face of people who will tell you, no, that's hateful because it's hurting me that you're not coming to Thanksgiving dinner. Right? And that's where trusting yourself and trusting your own emotions and being in a community that understands and supports you and gives you that strength in those hard times is critical. Because it is hard. You know, sometimes people use boundaries as a weapon. I've seen it. It's not always healthy to put up a boundary. Sometimes it is a way to punish, right? It's a way to take my ball and go home. Well, you're not going to do it my way? I'm going to have a boundary, right? That's a very personal experience to know how can we be in those spaces. Some people are just renegades. Like they are just activists through and through, and they're going to keep going into a space, and they're going to keep speaking truth to power, and they're going to keep those are the people who probably aren't conservative evangelicals anymore, but they're going to keep going to that same church on Sunday morning because they're going to be a gadfly and they don't care that they're hated. And like, bring it on. Like, I'm here to change your mind, right? And there's a loving way to do that too. There's a way to be loving in that space. But I think everybody has to determine that for yourself, what that is. And I have mine. Like I know, like I joked about online. Like, I don't know how many hundreds of hours I spent arguing with people online. I finally learned, right? It doesn't change anything. I have so many other spaces where I can make a difference. Why am I spending time here? It makes no sense. So when somebody says something wrong on the internet, I just say, here's 3 sentences on why I think you're incorrect. And if they come back, I say, thank you so much. I'm sorry. I hope you have a great weekend. And I just leave it. It's done, right? Where if my mom, who this year called and told me she disagrees with everything I wrote in my book. That was a fun conversation. That I'm willing to go there because she's earned it. 20 years of loving me well, taking care of me, like she's earned the conversation. She respects whenever I say things, like she's earned it, and so I'm going to put the energy there. But there's a lot of people in my life who did not earn it, and so I'm not going to put energy there, and I'm not going to feel bad about it. So I don't feel like we are compelled, either by our ethics or our faith, to subject ourselves to harmful situations that create pain in a way that's not sustainable for us. But I think that's a personal journey that everybody has to kind of figure out for themselves.
Thank you. Thanks. Good questions, guys. What'd you say, locked and loaded?
Locked and loaded. I have to be careful. I go to a Mennonite church now, and so being a Texan, I have
Yeah.
so many gun metaphors. I'm like constantly apologizing at my church. I'm like, yeah, I'm just going to shoot from the hip. I'm so sorry. I did. Like, just so many gun metaphors. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your questions. Yeah, we appreciate it very much. Okay. You are free to go. Enjoy your Super Bowl.